perhaps a current suitable here. Why is the West currently filled with immigration-related problems? A major reason, probably, is because we don't have Westerners in these Western countries. These in which are probably no longer countries and are no longer societies. They have the names of these historical past and these figures, and whether recent or whether mentioned, whether recent or whether first of. And even if the names are left, the interpreters are sort of not there, and whether recent or whether not in prominent position of. Somehow the vestige of the inheritance are given to foreigners through this algorithm called whether associate to, whether recent, whether associate, whether also relate to publicism. Through this taxation and then return these the gimmickry, insolent and disability freaks gets a lot. In ways there's no mediocreist. Each mediocreist without qualities, why is it not being sort of idle? Why is it not in a monastery instead staying in the society? If not have so much aggression, at least it will make errors that cause so much problems, especially when they are at these current counts. Each white people probably fills 200 capacity, whether it have 200 capacity. Times by 50, that's only less than a quarter of a stadium, probably. And the population of a single metropolitan is probably not much 200. That's sort of the whether reason whether, but whether reason whether also whether reason whether. That's some of the metropolitans. 200 of such. So if 50 ships will be called a armada or whether fleet, then 5 times that will be definite more of armada. Whether reason whether 500 times that. That's it in this planet sort of zombies whether reason whether first of. That's quite a huge numbers of weather in there, and that's a quite huge weather also, and weather above huge numbers also. I want to not just make it sort of match to success, I want to make it effective in order for do that. So therefore how hearing also states and besides somebody whether another daughter. So we could be all blobs, so most serves for greater good, and because most are identical, it only takes someone not recognized, but that's probably already sealed in. Thus fighting your way on comparison is sort of much better, and in that I think folks should attempt to find appreciation. I think so our guys already does, and by me sort of guidance towards it, that does better. Recent or two could be considered as minor literalization of. I think only a few folks are given this grant by nature to have whether by exterior, whether reason, whether also minor, instead of whether reason, whether probable, whether reason, and whether also whether reason, whether a minor, rather of sort of a herald abilities. So they're sort of the instructor, then others sort of follows. Noticing a lot of what we in modernity live today is all these instructions, these rules. They don't criticize as much as give regulations, but these regulations, what does it do? At minimum, in the case of the Gorams, is to serve their dramatism, whether reason, delusions. That could be quite sparking dangerous, right? The less the hearing, investigating whether reason, whether projectable, how this function, whether reason, whether, and also whether reason, whether probable, projectable, how this function, whether reason, whether how this function, the zombies that's on whether reason there, whether control of a minor repronunciation, or whether how this on whether reason or whether not a minor repronunciation of whether how whether probable of how this on the commission offices are run by not our guys. Much of doing these stuff, even these instructions, what does it really do? It will probably emphasize on whether if the basis is sort of not firm, if the default is not sort of sides with nature, whether it eventually causes some reaches to some catastrophe. Then these are quite not suitable. Suppose I were to evaluate weather, suppose were to weather recent weather minor instead of suppose were to evaluate weather recent weather. How about a minor recessive? I've got multiple stacks of feeble bonding. The weather recent there, weather in terms of weather recent weather not weather recent weather just weather recent there and weather in terms of description weather recent in terms of personality and weather recent weather and weather minor rather in terms of probable of personality. The Western is weather recent weather instead of the Westerns are probably more busy than bold. Weather recent weather the smart one, weather recent weather they can be weather recent they can be weather recent they are smart. And while the weather recent weather probable weather recent weather also weather recent weather probable exhibit the traits of busy, weather bitty. And things at the recent there beginning of a weather recent there in other instance also. Then of bold. So they can be technically right, but sort of in terms of basis and alignment, sort of short. There's a reason West is being targeted, perhaps something to do with their names, their languages. It is not particularly theirs, and that there can be a giant, whether a considerable generalization, whether the reason there, whether first, whether reason, whether also generalization. The languages is like invitation, is like they can state and they can be spitting on immigrants. The immigrant is what reason they spit on, which called my immigrants, which called by what reason whether another what reason whether also what reason whether might instead of what reason whether another what reason whether immigrants of they will still arrive because the language sort of doesn't serve as a natural inhibitor. Should we always explain what we do? If persons actually check on the East Asia groups and what they're doing, and also probable whether reason whether for another instance, whether reason whether for another example, for whether reason for another whether reason whether another example, for whether reason whether also whether reason whether example of India. Why is India sort of repellent? Because the name is India. India, what does it mean? Sort of passive wording. It's like they are killers too because they have the sound in. Who can produce in? If they can produce in, they're aggressive as any Viking brothers. Have we noticed the muscular folks are labeled as if they're strong, dangerous? It could be more than that. We must serve to the Deutsche Reich and not with the modernity instructions as much as we could. That sort of English language is always like that. You always highlight what you cannot do, not what you can succeed from. Notice the word you don't mention in Mandarin is like 成功. You can accomplish it. That's great. It's great for the country and for your folks. Instead here, whether reason whether efforts, whether reason whether and for your folk, for your people, for whether reason whether people of here it's like succeed. Like it's more catered towards something else. We should be speaking whether imbued with Croatian language and whether en français. I noticed something about French. It's much more poetic. It's less Nazism. While English, it sounds very cheery Nazism, and that's probably the most Nazism. Because it has a dysfunction to even bother with the cheeriness along with it, while not cheerful. So what is that? Probably Nazism dysfunction, whether quite a dysfunctional. We're supposed to mention a lot of those entities that's whether reason, whether also whether reason, whether entities that's mental illness sort of can be inaccurate because it's not so much of an illness. As opposed to illness, therefore it has a normal state, while those ones have it absent. So it can be a bit of inaccurate, may not be of addressing entirely whether reason, whether also whether reason, whether entirely. Notice the words, it's not like entire teve. What's wrong with that? In some other languages, more of those sounding instead is as much as it's just a sounding. That's usually for Nazism entity and whether modernity puppets. It's going to cause a difference because, for instance, you don't say Deutsche Reich anymore. You say Deutschly Reich. What is that? Are they in a carnival? To define Westernists, a good description is probably carnivals. That's what they're witty. That's what they're fast at. That's what they're excited about. Sort of that other excited about, and probably not so. Whether reason and whether also not excited about. They add words ed to everything, so you have to emphasize the past tense. What if I just mentioned was excite? What's wrong with it? What's morally wrong with it? Whether reason there, whether reason there, whether and whether reason whether first. Instead, they add ed so that we abrogate. You say you don't. You have to say I fighted, I shouted. You have to be slow. You have to. This is so exhausting. I don't want to do it, guys. This livelihood is too much for me. Let's just quit. It's all this stuff. Culture level contamination. Oh, camera angle hasn't been transferred. We'll take a minor recess. There might be perhaps of whether it's whether perhaps whether it's whether and whether reason whether the reason there to probable whether reason whether perhaps of some minor repetitions. What's the reason there and whether it started? Whether reason there and whether reason there and whether in terms of whether reason and whether reason there and whether starts of whether reason there and whether in terms of west whether reason and whether west you have some words to speak for it, whether reason or whether reason there, whether reason refuel, whether reason what namely for whether reason whether keep off. The reason for each probable considered as minor remark of whether reason whether another whether reason whether also whether reason whether before whether reason whether first of whether reason there and whether first of whether reason and whether as a minor remark and whether reason and whether of this west whether reason and whether this west is a giant anti-Hitlerist hub. One of the reasons Hitler fell down is because the anti-European passive-aggressive agriculture spawned automaton bots were engineering itself to this vastly robotic numbers, whether reason there's numbers. There's no way by reproduction they accidentally got them this way. They're choosing to target against us. While it is a war that goes casual, this level of dishonesty, that's whether reason where they could be named as whether reason there and whether reason there and whether another whether reason and whether minor rather whether reason and whether rather whether reason there and whether. Ever was a factor and whether reason or whether probable was the factor in this dramatism. It hasn't stated whether it's hostile or not. And then it becomes our guys are smarter ones. Our guys in ways are probably not smarter ones. Our guys are in a way probably more foolish. Notice the zombicists understand laws more than our guys. Understand the system to a far more extent. While our guys are sort of like fools, not even calculating. Right? As indicated by whether reason whether. As indicate whether reason whether and whether reason and whether as indicated from the numerous app stores. How the stuff are purchased, they sort of are naturally prevented from checking on the way, and that is right, that is honesty. That's how a community sort of works. We don't have every apple being sort of the stem, whether they're sort of children, whether offsprings, and when you have this formation, then it's certainly right, and it probably generates a weakness, and whether reasons are probable to be considered whether reason whether considered for whether reason whether another whether reason whether probable of considerable of a weakness of whether reason whether of a comparison of sort of less more exposed to damage from attacker risks. recent and minor recitation. But it could comparatively become more of a distortion note for, therefore, our guys, it becomes a sort of dampen remark. I didn't mention it, but it will become such. And they were interactive. Oh, I did mention this one, and therefore it didn't do any other crime. A lot to address. As much as sort of stuff are sort of logical, it's almost on notes, isn't it? Like we need a person with the correct notes. He register whether reason or whether minor rather, whether reason whether also other rather, whether reason whether just, whether reason whether also whether reason there, whether rather of sort of get it done right. Somehow it's going to cause it. Sometimes we don't have to explain the whole thing. We sort of already got it, right? This explains sort of translate to Zambas's language, this Nazism language or so. Reason there to two of which whether reason there to both and whether either to probable to could be probable, whether reason whether another probable to could whether reason and whether another repetition of whether reason and whether another minor whether reason and whether minor repetition, whether reason and whether to probable to could be probable and stuff. Who's invited to often literal form explain the effect and whether reason some blog whether content of some other medium before probably had mentioned it already. Whether reason had been whether reason and whether had been mentioned of whether reason and whether another whether reason and whether had whether reason and whether minor rather of whether reason and whether mentioned of. For a lot of the perhaps of members of whether reason whether probable of members of a society, whether a community, they all they have to do is sort of just be good. Believe in the stuff that's going to get them to accomplish it, to hire whether to reasonable amount and whether at least the enough of a productivity. Right? Noticing everywhere a lot of stuff from this sort of pinnacle avenue, whether pinnacle ground, whether pinnacle plateau, amongst other words of we can notice that outside it's most participate in contests where it's almost false. You have to be deadly and stuff, but it's going to be throughout. Then what's the outcome? It's someone brave, someone who understands this whole thing, and then it comes so the Jeebus returns sort of type of stuff. Probably it's going to be like that. And in order to achieve it, some of the instances it's not going to be so much. Although there's sort of no Jeebus. But everyone sort of understood it, and overall it's like a contest, whether a major, whether reason, whether a test, whether reason, whether also, whether reason, whether a test, when the face, whether reason, whether also, whether reason, whether another practice of minor rather of whether reason, whether another, whether reason, whether also, whether reason, whether just, whether reason, whether another, whether reason, whether another, and the similar phrase, whether reason, whether the phrase set thereof, whether reason, whether a testament of strength, whether some testaments, whether reason, whether perhaps of tests out there, they were probable to also to the gift. Because a lot of the actions is like sort of automated. Whether reason, whether reason, and whether reason, and whether yes, whether reason, and whether reason, and whether sort of automated. And their actions tribute to certain causes or to tribute to certain traits. They don't state they want a brave man. They may even do action that contradict it, but their main action, whether somehow overall, it will result to not due to so much of my tellings to them, but they will come to this bear marks where there must be some person who will probably be named hero and must, and whether reason, whether probable, whether reason, whether must, other words. And whether reason, whether other titles, whether reason, whether efforts of, whether reason, whether other names, or whether titles of. Those specific, restrictive, whether reason, there are major specific indications there. If someone with the brave, for instance, would sort of be being voted for in a way. It seems the notes come from sort of the quality of the person, whether the person can have been to adventures does these attitudes. And that sort of is a contest, well, a lot sort of missing, not because of misses of opportunity, as much of whether reason or whether, but more of didn't understand the rules of the game, and sort of they were not given this insight, and they couldn't, whether they were all given this insight, but they were not allowed the chance to read it. Whichever at the node, as some forces want to edit, they want to edit the outcome. They simply have to tweak, simply edit a yes or no somewhere, whether reason whether perhaps whether reason whether first whether reason whether to perhaps whether reason whether and whether rather of and whether probable for whether at first of. There's so much knowledge as I actually know. For instance, we don't check what's on the roof. A person's not a sort of a person, it's more of a whether reason or whether the person is sort of an enterprise. And that's what meditation, these mentions about meditation has been emphasizing on. They did not achieve it, sort of. They sort of achieve greatly for their roles. Can be a bit probable from whether reason whether probable from whether reason whether probable for a bit of whether reason a bit of probable can be a minor literalization of. I'm sort of the instructor of this whole place. I understand this stuff so really that it's surreal. If a chosen one understands this stuff and sort of has this effect because he's a chosen one, sort of some overexcitement, whether a bit of excitement and hesitation and remorse, probably also for whether reason whether just whether reason whether another, whether reason whether another, whether reason whether another, whether reason whether another, whether reason whether another of, whether reason there and whether reason there and whether reason of bit of excitement and perhaps of resentment or something, or some effect associated. Is this whether reason or whether some due causes, or whether some result in effect, whether some results in results, whether some results come from results, whether reason and whether probable and whether minor rather, whether reason and whether also rather, whether reason and whether and whether rather of some excitement and some hesitation with it, and and whether reason whether probable for amongst others of. Is this effect accounted for? Probably not so accounted for, but sort of absorbed. Whether reason whether sort of accounted for, but absorbed. Whether reason there, whether just whether reason whether, and also whether reason whether sort of not accounted for, but whether reason whether another, whether reason and whether sort of not accounted for, but would be absorbed. The whether so small. It's not something small that's a key. Notice the universe has walls that are so strong, it's actually indestructible. There might be something that you destroy it, but that's completely out of the realm. It can change, it has matter, but it sort of balances it out, because everything else sort of has its own stuff, or has itself. Notice that almost every person is actually the same. They're doing this maximum capacity, whether the maximum suitable, whether fitable choice for given the circumstance, who they are, their quality, traits, positions. Life can be almost like it's a mixture of stuff, and there's more so of a pattern than decisions. Whether the decision, whether reason whether the sort of whether reason whether also whether reason whether another, whether reason whether the sort of decisions. And we can sort of never get to the sort of the center point, because that's sort of the stem, and it's probably also perhaps of hearing in the sense of whether minor mention of the asymptote, whether reason or whether, and where the beam is, and where God sort of is at, whether reason and whether sort of where God is, and including what I mentioned, I may be serving to some causes, and it's going to be cheered from fellow partners, but it's almost impossible to mention to that position, because it's sort of infinity, the start of this whole place, that we cannot go back to, but sort of yet can go back to in this sort of SM meetings, whether reason whether, and sort of is at right now, whether recent, whether probable, and whether current. That may be a restraint, and probably in terms of restraintness, whether in terms of restraint similar to whether recent, whether perhaps also in restraint related topics of whether recent and whether related tropical seasonal islands. Social restraints, whether from problematic individuals and whether from sort of much more normal, whether reason, whether and whether perhaps of whether minor instead of whether much more natural would come from, whether much more of from society without so much of extensive amount of corruption and dirt, and whether reason and whether just whether reason and whether corruption, whether reason and whether thereof, whether reason and whether there, whether reason and whether corruption of. A person wants to do a lot, but then so that sort of gets trimmed down. Countable of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Mentioned as of first one is on another medium. Fifth one, whether fourth one is going to be transported. Countable as a sort of a set. May not be just one single, whether one note, whether one single proverb. Second one, third one, second one already mentioned. Fifth one probably countable already mentioned. Recent their phrase or whether phrases for probable to be considered as. Whether is or whether considered as whether is or whether another, whether is or whether another, whether is or whether perhaps of whether another, whether is or whether as author's own reference, whether is or whether as author's own reference. We don't check on the roof, and this has been ignored. This causes many panic. Notice in Wall Street, one of the reasons there's some beauty involved in modernity structures. It's still excitement, and it's still got the energy. It's not entire soggishness. So in a way, they're sort of our guys, and that's perhaps why we are not going to use nuclear bombs on them. It's going to be spared. Noticing the notes I hit, I'm such a wicked person in a way, because I'm smart enough to whether manage to hit a lot of notes. I have more spells combined. And if the person bypass the testament of faith, then all the ones I'll be sending is they will default without themselves having to literal format, and whether perhaps a literal format I understand, whether perhaps whether also, whether another, whether another perhaps of, whether perhaps also of literal understand of. They will sort of naturally repel, whether compelled to agree to, then oppose. It's sort of more comparative probable of oppose the chapter focus on whether the chapter, whether the reason, whether the purpose of the chapter on the. Like how to deny, namely brain. One sort of doesn't by denying brain, one sort of does by raising the lung. Noticing it's a battle of forces, almost like stuff that's urban, whether urban, whether reason, whether urban, whether reason, whether perhaps of, whether reason, whether perhaps of urban parallel, whether reason, whether parallel to this one, whether reason, whether perpendicular to this one, perhaps. Where whether reason, whether probable, whether reason, whether perhaps of, whether reason, whether probable, perhaps of, sort of the probable there represents of whether reason, whether perhaps of whether reason, whether another, whether reason, whether whether reason, whether minor, whether reason, whether perhaps of minor rather of whether reason, whether reason, whether probable of minor rather of whether reason, whether perhaps of perpendicular to this from. Das Vader represents sort of the lung. I better not do it too many times, otherwise I'm going to enter more of that mode for a duration permanently. And if I have to explain it more, then that's going to get more problematic, because it's going to be phased out. I don't like to impersonate two different characters. That's sort of opposite at once. It's like combine garlic with, it's like combining for whether reason, whether this instance of whether reason, whether this also of weather, recent weather. Also, this example of rice plus weather, recent weather, bread plus maybe not ketchup, whether ketchup the probable for also could be friend, soy sauce, or whether ketchup and soy sauce, whether recent weather, bread and soy sauce, right? So instantly, therefore, it's major problematic. Neither is the reason mentioned is sort of the magnitude corresponding to that. Whether reason and neither is the magnitude of the reason mentions thereof. So Prince Charming is he knows how to charm. He charms everything to everything. For example, I can say orange is a gracious fruit. It's what Allah has bestowed towards you. Whether this fruit had a long history, he too had traveled many journeys. He used to be at more humid areas where they could have more season. Then later, because the harvest, because of the arenas of life, whether the creatures that party with them, whether inhibited amongst the lands, were migrating to a different area, so they too curiously followed. Ooh, that was quite great. Can be amongst the other reason, other probable and other mentions. The person probably will be whether the children one probably will be Omni, and they will bring whether he will probably for presents whether reason or whether represents, and also probable for presents whether reason or whether represents, whether reason or whether probable for represents, and brings numerous tastes of life. And the contradiction of it probably forms a match to the asymptote, whether to the beam of this planet, whether reason there and whether also whether reason or whether this of whether reason or whether of this, whether reason whether perhaps of whether reason whether perhaps of this, whether reason whether another, whether reason whether minor rather, whether reason there whether reason thereof, whether and the reason, whether reason there and whether reason thereof, whether reason there and whether this life communities of whether reason or whether and whether minor rather of whether reason and whether reason or whether and whether reason there and whether whether reason or whether and whether reason there and whether of whether reason there and whether of this, whether reason whether this living forms community of what if it is being a weather reason there, consider if it is the weather reason, whether also weather reason, whether perhaps also weather reason or whether, what if it's weather reason or whether, consider of weather reason or whether and weather reason or whether and for weather reason or whether, consider if it weather reason or whether, another weather reason or whether and weather reason or whether, consider if it's all the same person but sort of weather reason or whether perhaps of a word soul, weather reason or whether perhaps of soul, whether reason or whether perhaps of the same soul but in different transformers. And then shouldn't one sort of have sympathy? Suppose they are operational. Dysfunction can probably get to a major extent. Hatred, the force of hatred, jealousy can be quite hypnosis. Life may not be built for beauty after all. It might be built for ugliness, and we sort of are the betrayers, and one of the reasons they call us as narcissistic. And what the reason that whether bigotry call, and why they don't even perform, most probably have, namely the stuff called some aches. Most of them are not in their, whether not in the position they would like to be. That's the problem with this place, right? A lot have to do with how much benefits they have received. Notice in these, even the doors is a human VIP. It works for some of our guys, therefore it doesn't indicate it's very peaceful in support of non-terrorism in case of these humanoids. Whether reason whether minor rather whether reason whether perhaps whether perhaps of whether reason whether perhaps of and for whether reason whether perhaps of also whether reason whether perhaps of also whether reason whether reason whether perhaps of also whether reason whether perhaps and minor rather of whether reason whether of these humanoids, and amongst probable, namely other instances of the gesture, whether namely of whether reason whether also namely for whether reason whether namely reruns of whether reason and whether perhaps of whether reason whether yes whether reason whether after perhaps of whether reason and whether reason and whether reruns of when the eye first time and noticing the force of Sauron represents the what the Taco Bell symbol has one whether reason whether it's probable, whether reason whether to also whether reason whether also whether reason whether also whether reason whether to perhaps of whether reason whether and perhaps of minor whether reason whether minor rather from whether perhaps of. Yeah, this thing has been registered into some portions of view. It doesn't indicate if I could be divided. Yep. Something not suitable for when it's modernity periods. That's in tres major. That may probably mainly for whether cures a bit of whether reason whether and reduce whether reason whether restore whether reason whether and whether first of reason there before whether reason whether first of and whether reduce some of the curiosity towards whether reason whether mention out of whether reason whether mention of whether reason whether perhaps of whether reason whether namely whether reason whether just of whether reason whether just whether reason whether namely of curiosity. And then there's probably the seeing heart. How come one knows which one is sort of your mate? It's produced by the heart. You don't even have to sort of ever notice in woman. You will immediately understand what to do. The seeing heart organ sort of organizes for this. And whether perhaps some other supporters. And this knowledge probably only the humanoids don't know. One can actually, whether there's proof for this, whether one can find proof of how ridiculous the mother reason, and whether how disastrously unwitty the Goran infants are. They really, it's not that later they got sort of smarter, including academia, whether reason whether another, for whether reason whether reason whether academia smarter of whether reason whether another, whether reason whether. It's not that later they got smarter of whether reason whether later they got whether reason whether they later became more smarter of whether reason whether reason whether also whether reason whether. It's not that later they became smarter of but they became more reason crazy and whether talking crazy. Cannibal as similar to one of instance mentioned video camera editing. It is being had to be some this color for it. When it's from terrorism, it's just go defend Detroit. And it's their mothers that should be fought against. Probably I noticed that the persons that do these pokerization hobbies at 2016 and whether reason whether namely 2016 AD probably is all instructed by their mothers. Something is interesting there. Something is contemptuous as many for syllabus. Remark whether similar whether is that whether purpose of whether reason whether another whether reason whether and also whether reason whether and also whether and whether first of whether reason whether for syllabus presentation present whether reason whether and whether minor rather of whether reason whether for syllabus purpose of reason thereof which whether reason thereof for syllabus purpose of probable whether reason whether minor whether reason whether rather of probable whether reason whether minor instead of was probable to also could be for whether reason and whether rather of probable to also to be of. The namely brain organ is probably the lowest organ. It's probably not even organ. It's probably just a giant tumor that got too large and became useful for a certain time period. Notice in a lot of the stuff, when persons think about certain negativities, so what do they think about first? Getting rid of their head. How come? How to counter it? Not by thinking more, but by breathing. Notice I heal. Notice if a person can heal, he's automatically good. Right? That's sort of how the rules are, and it doesn't therefore represent they cannot hold a knife. I think most of our guys can hold a knife, as also the movie's perfect, whether it's in a considerable amount of to be perfect, whether it's considerable to be enough of, whether it's considerable enough to be of, whether it's whether considerable enough of, whether it's perhaps of this, whether it's whether it was perhaps of, whether it's whether it's perhaps of to be considered enough of, whether it's whether reason there and whether also was namely of, whether reason whether also was the perhaps of namely of. So that's sort of still, some of our guys could be extremists, and for to be out there, then that's completely, and that's sort of not even, with not being slime also, that could be whether that's much of perhaps of extremism among extremists. So on the logical standpoint, and that's completely not right. As much as there's free thinking, most person will vote for us, because in a way Jeebus established that the stuff here isn't sort of the fight. The fight has already been won, and in a way it's the future person's teleported to present. Our guys win a fight, they become the next child they are supposed to be in, and there will be always just a shortage of enough numbers, whether not lethal enough that the opposition sides will be able to succumb and combat the much of the longitudinal force. In a way, this prediction towards future is almost in a way foolish, whether foolish intelligence, whether reason whether foolishness is intelligent, and whether reason whether foolishness of whether perhaps of whether reason whether perhaps of foolishness and intelligence of. But yet it's this very foolishness that gets the results. And in a way, almost every single evil opponent is sort of the same combination. And the differences come from this relativeness. I have stated a lot of philosophy probably here in this instance of, and I've got more. And what about in terms of weaponries? Even more. I may not even hit my full strength yet. I still think I have another metamorphosis to hit, and that might be more of my conversation to my slaves or to my citizens. Gotta have some fun sometimes, and girls just wanna have some fun, and girls just wanna have fun. May ate at the correct, whether a suitable amount of spice yesterday. That's what I use to breathe fire. The tongue is a survivor. He too is more peaceful than the brain. Brain, are you there? Yes, I'm here. Oh, what you doing? How was your day? Nothing. What are you holding? Did you finish your math quiz yesterday? I don't do math. Math are really good. You should give it a try. Brain may be much more malicious than that, much more hostile. Any sort of interactiveness may be probably regarded to as innocence, although there might be adaptation to this, and although whether reason whether and also of whether reason whether there whether reason whether another of whether reason whether perhaps of whether reason there whether perhaps of another of whether reason or whether there are some of our guys sort of more specialized to that field, so sort of have a control panel there. Our guys are widely dispersed, the whole place is infiltrated. I just have to in my other mode deny that we are victims. Whether reason there's been a giant 7 billion plot. All of our guys understand the code, they know the whether they also hear the awesomeness push, nuclear push, and we conquer this whole place back. Everyone is sort of a deadly imp, and if they didn't come with this giant transformer, whether later had to sort of, namely for whether reason whether, namely or the probable perhaps of grow. Then they sort of hit a bottom position. They can try to swim back, and some will be eliminated. As much as, and after that period, this probably won't be so much of a numbers, because the accumulation of the nobles and whether reason whether and whether first whether reason whether probable just whether reason whether the accepted will be producing and would be sort of replicating reason error mention as of whether reason whether also whether reason whether mention of. I have to release that. I've been doing too much combat, and this type of a bit of dishonesty probably not so good for health. So I gotta admit it, I'm evil, and we are just as evil as any others. We are sort of a mutated type of rats, and we're giant rats. Putin looks like a giant rat. I may not be entirely a giant rat. Probably also a bit of peacock and turkey sandwich. Prince Charming knows how to raise other person's appetites. Though there's some kindness, this whole ground, it's like serving to me. I just have to deny it. Most of my assets and terms are for the opposites. And when in that mode, sort of, it's no longer sort of this, and amongst other words, or whether reason whether jolly of and whether amongst other words, whether reason whether also whether reason whether descriptions of the probable of which whether reason whether to just whether reason whether just whether reason whether it's probable for talk probable for whether reason whether another to probable for whether reason whether it's probable to do of. And then these some of the extremist agorans mechanisms will be whether some of the extremist agorans whether reason whether also whether reason whether another whether reason there another probable for another for whether reason whether the probable for not just another for whether reason whether it's probable for another whether reason and whether somebody whether reason and whether and whether reason and whether some of the extremists of gorans of will be puzzled. All that question they don't even remember. They'll just go by our words. Meanwhile we're holding weapons, and they simply abide with, and then often they sent to jail and admit it happened. In a way, life is always on maximum problems. We tend to regard these problems as not problems and enjoy it. What's the difference between citizenship and slavery? It's almost none. You could call it slavery. It's sort of, if the person doesn't state it as such, therefore it does. What if the statement of such is already on how, if it's slavery, it still wouldn't be mentioned as slavery. So it's logical to start a slavery, because whether it's sort of a Croatian name, whether Français, whether it's whether French word for what, because whether it's whether a sound may not be as comparative, whether it's as optimum, whether it's whether perhaps whether it's whether as perhaps of optimal, whether it's whether as whether it's whether another, whether reason whether as perhaps of optimal, for whether reason whether perhaps of as optimal. I add a lot of whether of, sort of not add, it comes with. How about whether reason whether, how about whether reason whether and it comes with. Because if we speak in the other format, which is Gorian format, it's much catered towards nothing. It's modernity standardization. Reason there phrase and whether phrase is probably to be considered suitable for retrieval. So it can be very much understood, because that's probably more of a natural language. And whether reason, that's how English language used to be and should be of. Suppose a person works in field, have some vacation for 2 months. They come back, their accents all come more balanced towards the natural way to speak, not this modernity that's bit associated. Reason there to comparative to be quite whether perhaps also whether reason whether perhaps the dress whether reason whether another whether reason whether whether reason there whether reason adjacent and whether reason there and whether another for whether reason there, and quite a brief and whether short of whether reason whether of a shorter whether brief of probable which is probable also suitable whether reason whether and whether first of probable is also to cook you. reason there phrase and whether reason there remark and whether remarks of the probability to be considered as whether reason whether phrase and whether phrases of the probability to be considered as minor remarks of. When the eye first sees itself, that's sort of the first moment. That gets the probable for a bit awkward of whether reason or whether minor pronunciation, whether reason whether a bit of whether reason whether ends, whether reason whether another of whether reason whether reason there, whether reason or whether another, whether reason there, whether a bit of awkward of whether reason or whether ends. Also whether reason or whether reason there and whether ends, whether reason or whether reason there and whether represents and whether minor rather for whether reason there and whether reason there and whether minor rather of and whether reason there and whether awkward of. The very sort of nonsense related spillage, so whether reason there, whether nonsense related spillage, whether reason whether the nonsense associated with largely comes from the terrorist groups, whether reason whether from the terrorists, whether reason whether from the terrorists, whether sort of terrorism blamed, whether terrorism Lancasted, whether reason whether and whether also minor of whether reason whether minor instead of whether reason whether our terrorism casted to the other groups of whether reason whether perhaps of and whether to the other groups. Whether reason whether another, whether reason whether perhaps of whether reason whether another, whether reason whether reason there, whether minor rather, whether reason whether also minor rather of whether reason whether also whether reason there, whether rather of whether reason there, whether also whether reason whether also rather of whether reason there and whether to other groups of. To perhaps of whether reason or whether to perhaps of two other groups of the reason there to probable of the probable for whether reason or whether to probable to be considered as minor repetition of the probable to be counted here in whether reason or whether the probable countable as transferred to here in this medium of so in the other medium and whether reason there sort of probable to be considered whether reason or whether also and whether reason or whether another, whether reason or whether probable to be considered, whether reason or whether considered whether reason or whether the portion of whether reason or whether being whether reason or whether portion of whether reason or whether reason or whether minor rather of whether reason there and whether another, whether reason or whether being of whether reason or whether portion of being whether reason there or whether perhaps of exclusively here in this medium of whether reason there whether and whether minor rather for whether reason there whether perhaps of exclusive of whether reason there whether is a probable of whether reason whether perhaps of and whether reason there and whether exclusively this medium of. What should the Zabasis and whether domestic terrorists about vast whether reason or whether whether reason or whether perhaps or whether probable whether reason or whether perhaps of the probable of whether reason or whether another whether reason or whether reason or whether another virtue of whether reason or whether does this whether reason or whether terrorism does this sort of self-serve deprecate whether reason whether perhaps of deprogram whether reason whether and perhaps of whether minor rather whether reason whether just whether reason and whether reason there phrase and whether phrases whether reason and whether phrases whether reason there and whether reason there and whether terrorism does this self-serve terrorism attitude of whether recent and whether not system does whether recent and whether is not system attitude. Let's go into get it in bracket within whether with bracket marks of count down, comma symbol mark, and whether erased of whether recent and whether erased of. So this is a bit of a transport to here in this medium of then the format stays with whether recent and whether therein is on their medium, it will be as much kind of as a earlier noting of whether recent and whether recent there whether at moments before whether recent and whether and before a kind of whether recent and whether and before countable as a before note whether recent whether and whether as whether recent and whether minor rather as a earlier note of and whether recent there and whether they mention there on whether recent there and whether mention sort of they are and here whether recent and whether first whether recent and whether mention there on instance whether recent there and whether also whether recent there and whether mention here on this medium of the recent kind of was notes complete and that's it. It's still widespread and we have a lot more work to do. It's not a easy mode in these anesthetic traits. I had mentioned considerable amounts on the blog and also the contents on various other mediums of recent there of a phrase maybe comparative whether suitable for some other instance and whether for some other instance or whether for some instance of whether recent there and whether for some instance whether recent whether maybe another whether recent whether another from whether recent whether probable of another of whether recent whether for other instance of whether recent whether other instance of whether recent and whether minor rather of whether recent there and whether the end whether represents and whether and minor rather of whether recent and whether there and the probable for whether recent and whether minor rather whether recent there and whether minor rather of whether recent there and whether and minor rather of whether recent and whether to perhaps of whether recent and whether to perhaps of and minor rather of. So with whether recent there and whether with the indicator remark towards to whether recent and whether there and whether minor rather from whether to perhaps of whether recent and whether also and whether minor rather of whether recent there and whether also whether recent there and whether recent there and whether rather of could be a bit of minor retrieval of recent there whether and perhaps of whether minor rather of what recent there and whether there could be a bit of minor remark and whether remarks of recent there indicator force. The recent mention whether phrase thereof to probable to could be of and to probable to also suitable. To probable to also to could be of and whether it's probable to could be of. Whether recent there and whether as whether recent and whether to probable of could be of. To probable for which whether recent there and whether minor rather for to probable of to probable to also to could be of and whether it's probable of to could be of. Whether recent there and whether it's probable of to could be of. To probable of to probable to also to could be of. Whether recent and whether it's probable of to also to could be of. And whether it's probable of to could be of. Whether recent and whether probable considerable as a minor repetition. Whether recent whether as minor whether recent whether as minor remark. Whether recent and whether it's probable of also whether recent whether as minor repronunciation of to probable of to also to could be of and whether it's probable of to could be of. Whether recent and whether it's probable of to and whether to also suitable of and whether to probable of to perhaps of to suitable of and whether recent and whether minor rather and whether recent and whether and perhaps another of whether recent whether perhaps another whether recent whether another of whether recent and whether another perhaps of whether recent whether another perhaps another of whether recent and whether to probable of to also to suitable of whether recent there and whether minor rather of to probable of to also the suitable of whether reason there, whether and whether minor rather, whether and also whether reason there, and whether moderate rather of whether reason there, whether also rather of whether reason there, whether the probable of also to be of the probable of whether reason there, whether reason there, whether the probable of also to be of and whether reason there, whether rather and whether minor, whether reason or whether minor rather, whether reason or whether minor instead of the probable of to also to be of and whether it's probable of to be of.